A severed head may stay aware for up to 30 seconds after it is cut away. In that awful half-minute, the eyes can still blink, the lips may try to form words, and a thin thread of awareness holds on while life slips away. For Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife and the queen who would be remembered for her beheading, this terrible fact was only one small part of what made her end so cruel. The famous stories often smooth over the horror. The real truth of her last hours shows a slow, careful breaking of a person's mind and name, more like torture than a single stroke of a blade. Her execution was planned as a public show. It was meant to destroy not only her body but her memory. It was not just a punishment, it was a message. Henry's court set the stage to erase everything she had been. By the time May 19, 1536 came, Anne Boleyn had already spent 17 days shut in the Tower of London, the same prison where she had once rehearsed for her coronation. Only 3 years earlier, she had been crowned in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Now she waited in a strange, empty calm, her fate delayed and stretched by those who wished to break her. They brought in a foreign swordsman from Killala to cut her down, a detail people call mercy because a sword could be quicker than an axe. But that choice only made the event more theatrical. It showed how the court wanted the execution to look, not how to make it kinder. In her last hours, Anne seemed almost unnervingly calm. Witnesses said she appeared cheerful, joking in a way that hid the fear inside. Today we might call that dissociation, a mind's way of stepping away when pain and terror become too much. She is said to have joked she would be known as enceinte, even without a head, a brittle laugh that covered the shock. Few accounts tell of the deep terror she must have felt as her name and honor were torn apart by false accusations. Adultery, incest, and plots to kill the king. Henry did not only want her dead, he wanted to make sure she would be forgotten. He wanted her achievements erased and even her daughter Elizabeth pushed out of the line of succession. The whole trial and execution worked together to rewrite what people would remember. Before the execution, Anne was forced to listen to ugly lies about her life. People told stories of sexual crimes so wild they would be laughed out of any fair court. The morning of May 19th broke bright and clear, in odd contrast to the darkness that would follow. Anne had spent the night praying but had little sleep. Records show she asked for the sacrament at 2 in the morning and knelt for hours, trying to find peace. By dawn, she had been awake nearly a full day, worn thin by fear and waiting. When the guard came for her, she laughed with her ladies, a sign not of peace but of a mind fraying at the edges. The execution had been set and reset more than once. This endless waiting was itself a form of torture. The not knowing, the clock that never stops. At last, she was led through the same halls where she had walked as queen. Guards kept her close, not with respect, but to stop any hope of escape. The people who had bowed to her now watched with cold faces. The stage was ready, and what followed was meant to erase a life. The scaffold built on Tower Green stood strangely low, only 3 feet above the ground. It was not the high wooden stage shown in films. This was deliberate. With so few steps to climb, Anne was denied the height that might have given her dignity. Instead, she was kept close to the crowd, close enough for their eyes and whispers to pierce her. The people had not been gathered for silence and respect. They had been called for spectacle. The king's justice was theater, and Anne's death was meant to be its main act. Some later paintings show her death as solemn, almost holy, but real records tell a different story. Witnesses described a carnival-like scene, voices rising like a crowd at a show. This was no silent mourning. It was planned chaos, a warning carved into the air for any woman who might think to rise too high. Before she died, tradition demanded that Anne give a final speech. It was not mercy. It was duty, the last act a condemned prisoner must perform. Her words were careful, measured. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. For according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. To some these lines sound like surrender, but hidden within them was quiet rebellion. She accepted the sentence without ever admitting guilt. Even with death before her, she refused to confess to lies. The king himself was absent. Henry stayed at Whitehall Palace waiting for word that the execution was complete. Even in her last moment, Anne was discarded, unworthy of his presence. While she prayed and prepared for the blade, he celebrated his next marriage. Jane Seymour was already waiting. The queen was dead before her body even fell. The swordsman from Killala was brought in at great cost. They say he was skilled, trained to make death swift with a single stroke. The axe used in England often required several blows, hacking at bone and sinew. But the foreign sword brought its own cruelty. It was unfamiliar to Anne. In her last seconds, she would kneel not before a known custom, but before a stranger holding a blade meant for a clean show. When they blindfolded her, it was not kindness. It was control. A prisoner who cannot see, cannot flinch, cannot move at the wrong instant, cannot spoil the spectacle. She knelt upright as the French method demanded, not resting her neck on a block. This forced her to hold still by strength alone. Witnesses said her lips moved in prayer the whole time. Beneath the cloth, her eyes flicked side to side, straining to catch the sound of the sword as it was raised. Imagine the terror. Death certain, yet the moment unknown. A silence heavy enough to crush the breath. That was her last torture. The stroke was clean. Her head fell with one swing. But the silence broke with gasps and cries as her eyes still blinked. Her lips still shaped words. A body refusing to know it was gone. People fainted. Others turned away. The show had ended, yet horror lingered in the air. No coffin had been prepared. No honor. No ceremony. Her ladies, broken with grief, found only an arrow chest to carry her remains, a queen buried like a nameless body, shut into the ground without rites, without care. Even in death, she was made to vanish. After the sword fell, the horror did not stop. Witnesses swore that Anne's lips still moved, as if she tried to finish the prayer cut short by steel. Her eyes blinked, her face still alive though her body lay apart. This was no peaceful death. It was a sight so terrible that some fainted, others turned away, and all who remained carried the memory with them. The body was left without care. The Queen of England treated as though she were no more than a problem solved. No coffin waited for her. No shroud had been made. Her ladies in waiting, crushed with grief, had to scramble for something to hold her broken remains. They found only an arrow chest, a wooden box meant for weapons, and in it they laid her body and head. It was not a queen's burial, it was an insult. They placed her in an unmarked grave in the Tower Chapel. There was no Christian ceremony, no prayers for her soul. Her death was meant to erase her, and even her resting place reflected that. Henry wanted no memory of her to linger. She had been queen once, but even in death she was treated as nothing. The king's rage reached even further. Her portraits were destroyed, her emblems scraped from the walls, her name spoken only in whispers, and if at all. People learned quickly that to speak of Anne was to invite the king's displeasure. She had not only been killed, she was being erased. But the execution scarred more than just her memory. Her ladies, who had to wash her blood and prepare her severed head, were left broken. They carried nightmares for years, some unable to continue their lives at court. At least one fled to a convent, choosing silence and shadow over the memory of what she had seen. The pain reached her daughter too. Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was branded illegitimate. She was stripped of her place in the line of succession. In the space of a day, she became fatherless and motherless, cast aside like her mother's name. Records tell us her clothes no longer fit for a princess, her attendants dismissed, her small household dissolved. The cruelty was not limited to Anne. It reached even into her child's cradle. The morning of Anne's death was bright, the May air heavy with warmth, but Tower Green stank of old blood. The scaffold was not clean. Flies buzzed in the heat, crawling over the dried stains left by others who had met their end before her. This was the true stage of her death, not polished, not noble, but soaked in decay. The crowd roared, their voices rising like waves. But many of those cries were planted, ordered by the crown itself. They shouted her down, called her whore, traitor, witch. These words were not simply anger. They were tools of power. The king's men had prepared the crowd to mock her, to drown out any sympathy, to crush her reputation even as her body was destroyed. Her last speech, often painted as noble, was really the speech of a woman trapped. She praised the king, called him gentle and sovereign, not because she believed it, but because she knew she had no choice. Even in death, her words were bound. Her voice was censored. Her final breath was not her own, but shaped by fear of what would happen to those she left behind. Her death was not just a killing, it was a warning, a queen reduced to silence, her story rewritten in blood. The sword that ended Anne's life had been specially brought from France. It was not the rough English axe, but a weapon chosen to make the death swift, clean, and above all, theatrical. Henry spared no cost. He wanted her fall to look like a performance, sharp and precise, a spectacle worth remembering. The swordsman himself had trained for this moment. He had practiced on animals, testing the blade, learning its weight, making sure it could slice in one perfect strike. His fee was heavy, his skill paid for in gold. It was not compassion, it was cruelty disguised as ceremony, the cold professionalism of death. The English executioners would not take the task, not because of pity, but because the sword required training they did not have. An axe they could swing, a sword demanded skill. The French blade was long, razor sharp, meant to cut across the neck in a single horizontal slice. This detail shows the truth. Anne's death was not simply justice. It was arranged to be a show, neat and controlled, with no messy hacking to stain the king's image. When the blow was done, Thomas Wyatt, imprisoned in the Tower and forced to watch, wrote of the little throat that had had so many jewels hung about it. His words turned grief into poetry, remembering the same neck once wrapped in pearls, now severed and lifted for all to see. The executioner held her head aloft by the hair, blood dripping down, arteries still pumping. It was the final display, the proof that the sentence was complete. The crowd saw not a woman, not a queen, but a symbol of what power could do. Her ladies rushed forward, weeping, wrapping the head in linen. They had to gather her like broken pieces. The arrow chest was brought again, and in it her body was sealed. No coffin carved, no tomb prepared, no marker placed. She was lowered beneath the chapel floor like contraband, buried beside other condemned souls. For centuries her grave would not be known. Even her resting place had been stolen. This was not accident. It was the end of Henry's plan to erase Anne completely. Her name was scraped from walls, her emblem struck away, her likeness destroyed. What once was honor became danger, and no one dared keep her memory alive. To mention her could cost your place, perhaps your life. Silence was the new law. Propaganda rose to take her place. Poets who once praised her beauty now called her schemer, adulteress, whore. Officials told the people the king had been merciful, bringing the skilled swordsman instead of the axe. Lies were spun until the cruelty seemed kindness. History itself was rewritten while her body lay cold. For Henry, there was no pause. The very next day, he was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks, he was married. The woman he had called queen, the woman he had destroyed, was gone, replaced as though she had never lived. Her death was not tragedy to him. It was a solution, a clean break, a turning of the page. Anne was gone, her memory hunted, her daughter cast aside. She had been Queen of England, yet she was buried as though she had been nothing at all. And that was the true cruelty. Anne's death was not only in the sword. For weeks before her mind had been pulled apart piece by piece, the cruelty began long before the scaffold. Locked in the Tower, she was denied rest, denied comfort, denied peace. She was questioned again and again, cut off from her friends, stripped of support. Thomas Cromwell, the king's minister, shaped the charges and shaped her downfall. He used lies and fear like weapons. What he did was not unlike torture. It was the slow breaking of a spirit, no beatings, no flames, but methods that drained the soul just as surely. Isolation, endless questions, nights without sleep, false stories whispered in her ear. Each detail aimed to make her bend, to leave her hollow when the time for death came. By the day of her execution, Anne had already been undone in her mind. The scaffold was only the last act. Even the guards showed how far the king's fear went. The Tower was filled with soldiers, more than was ever needed. The garrison was doubled, extra men placed in every corner. These precautions were not to stop Anne. She had no power left to flee. They were to stop others, to crush any hope that someone might save her or call out against the crime. The strength of the soldiers was not for her, but for those watching. It was intimidation turned into stone and steel. Her execution was not set for dawn, as was custom. No, Henry wanted the hour later, when more could attend. Mid-morning, when the city was awake, when the people could gather, when the news could spread wide. The bells of London rang when her head fell, so that even those outside the Tower walls knew the moment of her end. It was not just death, it was a message, a sound carved into the city itself. And yet Anne was not the only one marked. 5 men died before her, accused of sins with her. Among them was her brother, George Boleyn. The charges claimed he had shared her bed, broken holy law, stained the crown with incest. Lies so wild, so filthy, that they blackened Anne before her trial even began. By killing the men first, Henry and Cromwell ensured the story could not be broken. Their deaths made her guilt seem certain, their silence sealing her fate. 6 lives wiped away with the same false hand. The executions were like a net, carefully tied. No one could slip through. Anne's fall was not just about her, but about showing what happened to any who rose too high, too close to the throne. Today, Tower Green bears a memorial stone, a mark for where people think she died. But records tell another truth. The scaffold likely stood elsewhere. Its place shifted. Its story moved over time. Even her death has been twisted, relocated, reshaped to suit the tale others wanted to tell. The real place, the real blood, the real boards are gone, leaving only shadows and uncertainty. The story people like to remember is of a noble queen meeting her fate with grace. But the truth is darker. The truth is of a woman torn down, her mind and body destroyed in slow steps, her name dragged through mud, her memory buried. The execution was not just an ending, it was an erasure. Anne's death was not just the fall of a queen, it was a performance carefully staged for power. Every part of it was designed to send a message, to control what people believed and to twist the truth until it served the crown. Even the smallest detail was chosen for effect. The scaffold itself was placed where the crowd could see and hear, though Tower Green could only hold a few. Beyond the walls, Londoners gathered in the thousands, waiting for word. When the axe or sword finished its work, bells rang across the city. The sound carried through the streets, through churches and markets, forcing every ear to know the queen was gone. It was not only an execution, it was a broadcast of fear. The truth of Anne's death was stripped away piece by piece. Her final speech, later painted as noble defiance, was something else. It was not freedom, but the opposite. She praised the king, called him gentle, called him sovereign lord. Her words were shaped by fear. Even in her last breath, she knew her daughter's future depended on her tone. A wrong word could have cursed Elizabeth forever. So Anne's voice was not her own. It was bound, twisted, censored by the shadow of Henry. The sword itself was part of the act. Imported from France, sharpened until it gleamed, it was not chosen to spare Anne pain. It was chosen to spare the king shame. A clean stroke meant no screams, no messy hacking, no doubt about the power of justice. The swordsman's skill was turned into theater, his blade into a prop of control. He practiced before the day, striking animals, testing his arm, making sure the queen's death would look smooth, efficient, almost elegant. Her body became not a body, but an object in a cold performance. Anne was not simply killed, she was processed. Her suffering was shaped into a message for all who watched. Power reduced her to a symbol, stripped her of her humanity, and turned her into a warning. Even the witnesses were broken by it. Thomas Wyatt, locked in the Tower, forced to watch the woman he had once admired lose her life, wrote later of her throat, the same throat once covered with jewels, now cut open, silent. His words dripped with sorrow, but also with horror at how quickly beauty had become ruin. When the executioner lifted her head high, the blood still running, the crowd saw not Anne but proof of the king's control. The cheers that followed were demanded, not born from truth. The horror was swallowed under the noise, under the fear that silence might be seen as disloyalty. Her burial was no burial. The arrow chest was dragged forward, her remains stuffed inside, lowered into the chapel floor without right or honor. A queen buried like a thief, no stone, no marker, nothing to tell where she lay. For centuries her bones were lost, her resting place hidden as if she had never lived at all. This was Henry's wish, to cut her not only from life, but from memory. Her story was stolen, her truth was smothered. Her death was not only an execution, it was the destruction of a name. Ruth is of a woman torn down, her mind and body destroyed in slow steps, her name dragged through mud, her memory buried. The execution was not just an ending, it was an erasure. Anne's execution did not end with her death. It spread outward, reaching the living, poisoning all who had stood close to her. Her ladies-in-waiting, forced to remain by her side, became unwilling servants of horror. They had to lift her head, clean her blood, and prepare her broken body for burial. Their hands shook, their tears fell, but they did not dare disobey. Fear bound them as tightly as grief. These women carried the memory like a wound. Some dreamed of it for years, waking in terror at the sight of the sword, the smell of blood. At least one withdrew from court forever, entering a convent where silence might keep the nightmares at bay. Anne's death was not hers alone. It spread like a shadow over all who saw. And then came the cruelty that reached her child. Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old when her mother was cut down. She was stripped of her title, her claim to the throne erased. The daughter of a queen was branded a bastard. In the space of a single day, the child was orphaned, her mother dead, her father a king who denied her. Records tell us her small household was broken apart. The attendants who had cared for her were dismissed. Her fine clothes were taken away. She was left without the dignity even a child deserved. The punishment that killed Anne also fell on her daughter, a child too young to understand why her world had suddenly grown cold. The cruelty did not stop with the family. The whole city bore witness. On that bright May morning, the Tower was not silent. The scaffold reeked of blood from earlier deaths. Flies swarmed, crawling over old stains, buzzing in the warmth. The air itself carried the stench of death. The crowd gathered not by chance but by design. Supporters had been planted to jeer, to call her witch, traitor, whore. Their shouts rose like thunder, drowning out any voice of pity. The noise was a weapon, a wall of sound meant to strip her of dignity, to make her less than human even in her last moment. This was the heart of Tudor justice, death as humiliation. Execution was not enough. The condemned had to be broken, mocked, displayed as warnings. Anne was not only killed, she was disgraced, her image shattered before the people's eyes. Her final words, remembered now as noble, were really shaped by chains. She praised Henry, called him merciful, gentle, a sovereign lord. But she had no choice. Every word was weighed with fear. She knew her daughter lived or died by how she spoke. Her last speech was not her truth. It was the silence of truth, twisted into obedience. Her voice was censored, even as the sword waited. She could not name her innocence, could not call out the lies, could not speak the betrayal. Her silence was forced, her words bound by power. That was the deepest cruelty. Even in death, Anne was denied her own voice. Her story was rewritten even as her body grew cold. The queen who had once walked crowned in glory was turned into a traitor, and the world was told to cheer. The sword that struck Anne was more than a weapon. It was a symbol, chosen not only to end her life, but to shape how the end would be remembered. Imported from France, sharpened to a deadly edge, it was unlike the rough English axe. The king paid dearly for it, turning Anne's death into a performance, a display of skill and precision. The swordsman himself became part of the theater. He had been brought at great cost, his reputation built on clean, swift killings. He even practiced on animals before the day, making sure his stroke would not falter. For him it was work, a test of craft. For Anne it was the last cruelty, to die as part of another man's demonstration. This was the cold face of power. Death not as justice, but as spectacle. Anne was not granted dignity. She was made into an object in someone else's play, her suffering reshaped into proof of the king's control. Contemporary accounts tell us that no Englishman would take the job. It was not pity that stopped them, but lack of skill. The French blade required training, a sideways swing that cut cleanly across the neck. The axe was simpler, if bloodier, its blows often clumsy. Henry wanted no clumsiness. He wanted control, even over death itself. When the moment came, the swordsman lifted the blade with practiced calm. To the crowd, it was a show of mastery. To Anne, it was terror wrapped in silence. The blindfold had already been tied, robbing her of the sight of her killer. She did not know the second, only the sound of feet shifting, the air breaking, the strike unseen. The blow fell. Her head dropped. Her lips still moved. Her eyes still blinked. For a moment she seemed alive. A body that refused to understand it had been severed. The crowd gasped. Some turned pale, others fainted. This was no merciful end. It was horror laid bare for all to see. Thomas Wyatt, watching from the tower, turned her death into words of grief. He remembered the small throat once dressed in jewels, now cut and silenced. His sorrow was proof of how beauty and power had been turned into ruin in a single stroke. The executioner raised her head high, gripping her hair. Blood dripped, the face pale, the eyes glassy, but not yet still. It was the final gesture, the moment to show the people their queen was truly dead. Cheers rose, planted and forced, a wall of sound to drown the silence of shock. Her ladies rushed to her body, tears falling as they wrapped her head in cloth. They carried her away like broken fragments, placing her in the arrow chest once more. No coffin, no honor, no grave prepared. She was buried in the chapel floor, hidden among others without a stone to mark her place. A queen reduced to nothing. A life ended not with dignity, but with display. The sword was sharp, but sharper still was the cruelty behind it. After Anne's head fell, her story did not end. The horror continued in silence, in shadows, in the way her memory was torn apart piece by piece. The king's men worked quickly to twist what had happened. They reshaped her into a lesson, a warning, a ghost stripped of truth. Her remains were buried hastily beneath the chapel floor. No stone marked her grave. No prayer was spoken over her body. She lay hidden with others, a queen reduced to dust among traitors. For centuries, her exact resting place was forgotten. It was as if Henry's wish had been granted, that she vanish, body and name alike. Her memory was hunted just as her body had been. Painters were ordered to destroy her portraits. Emblems of her reign were cut from palace walls. To speak her name was dangerous, a risk of falling into the king's disfavor. Silence became the safest choice. Anne was not simply dead, she was forbidden. But even silence could not stop the poison her execution spread. Her ladies-in-waiting carried scars too deep to heal. They had lifted her head, cleaned her wounds, placed her body in a box not fit for a queen. The sight followed them into their dreams, clawed at them in the night. Some could never return to court. At least one fled to a convent, seeking safety in shadows, away from the blood that haunted her. And then there was Elizabeth. Barely 3 years old, she was left motherless, stripped of her royal claim. The child of a queen became the child of a disgraced woman. Her clothes were taken, her household dismissed, her status torn away overnight. She was left vulnerable, a symbol of shame rather than hope. The cruelty reached even to the cradle. This was Henry's design, not only to end Anne, but to destroy all that remained of her bloodline, her name, her legacy. She was not meant to linger in memory. She was meant to be erased. The morning of her death had been bright, but Tower Green was not clean. The wood of the scaffold was stained with old blood, buzzing with flies in the May heat. The crowd was restless, loud, manipulated by the king's agents. Shouts of witch and whore filled the air, not from truth but from design. Her execution was not only killing, it was theater, meant to humiliate, meant to bury her dignity before the sword struck. Her speech, often painted as noble, was a mask. Her words praising the king were chains, spoken to protect her child, spoken to survive even in death. But survival was impossible. Her words were twisted, her silence forced. She died with her truth locked inside, censored even in her final breath. The blade was swift, the blood quick to fall, but the cruelty was slower, deeper. It lived on in those who saw it, in those who lost her, in those who were forced to forget. Anne's death was not just the end of a queen. It was the erasure of a life, the rewriting of a story, the breaking of memory itself. The horror of Anne's execution was not just in the sword that struck her down. It was in the lies that wrapped around her like chains, dragging her name into filth before her body ever touched the scaffold. The charges against her, adultery, incest, conspiracy to poison the king, were not simply false. They were outrageous, twisted so wildly they would never have survived in any true court. But Henry's court was not true. It was power wearing the mask of justice. The men accused with her had already been killed, their deaths shaping the tale that would condemn her. Confessions pulled from them with fear and pain became the proof, their silence in death sealing her fate. The story was not about truth, it was about control. The king's will was the law, and Cromwell's lies were its weapon. What made this cruelty more haunting was not only the physical death, but the destruction of reality itself. People were told to believe the lies, to cheer the fall of a queen they had once adored. Propaganda filled the air. Court poets who had praised her beauty now spat venom in verse, calling her faithless, schemer, witch. Painters destroyed her likeness. Her emblems were broken from stone. The woman was not only killed, she was remade into a monster. This is the true horror, not just the beheading, but the gaslighting of a nation, the careful twisting of facts until the people no longer knew what was real. Anne's death became proof that even truth itself could be bent, reshaped, erased when power demanded it. Henry did not wait in mourning. The very day after Anne's death, he became engaged to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks, he was married. The speed of it turned her execution into a mere step, a solved problem, swept aside as he reached for his next wife. The queen who had once been his obsession was now nothing more than a body in the ground, forgotten before the earth above her had settled. Anne's death was called justice, but it was never justice. It was statecraft, power clearing the path to a male heir. It was politics dressed as law, cruelty shaped into performance. Her fall was meant to prove that no woman, no courtier, no noble was safe if they stood in the king's way. The spectacle was complete. The scaffold, the crowd, the speeches, the sword, the lies, every piece fitted together like parts of a grim machine. And when the machine finished its work, Anne was gone. Not only from life, but from memory, from record, from history itself. Yet something lingered. The silence of her grave, the whispers of those who had seen too much, the faint memory of the woman she had been, hidden under layers of lies. Henry had wanted her erased, but in trying to wipe her away, he carved her more deeply into the darkness of history. Her death was not only the end of a queen, it was the warning of what power can do, how it can twist truth, destroy memory, and bury a life beneath silence. Anne's death was only the surface. Beneath it lay weeks of torment, a slow crushing of body and mind designed to break her before the sword touched her skin. The tower walls became her cage, but the true torture was not stone. It was the silence, the questions, the long nights without sleep. Cromwell, Henry's minister, shaped it all like a craftsman of cruelty. She was isolated from her allies, left to face whispers and false tales alone. Every day brought new accusations, each more twisted than the last. Sleep was stolen from her, her thoughts driven into madness by exhaustion. Lies reached her ears, painting her as unfaithful, as murderous, as vile. The goal was not to learn the truth. The goal was to strip her of it, to make her doubt herself until she was nothing but a shadow waiting for death. By the time she stepped onto the scaffold, Anne was already hollowed out. The sword was only the last step, the final piece of a design that had begun long before. The security around her showed how much fear still clung to Henry. The tower garrison was doubled. Extra guards stood at every corner. Not because Anne posed a threat. She had no army, no weapon, no escape. The soldiers were for the people, to crush any chance of rescue, to silence any voice that might rise for her. The show of force was its own message. To sympathize was to risk your life. Even the timing of her death was chosen with care. Dawn had always been the hour of executions, when light was still weak and crowds were thin. But Henry delayed it. He wanted mid-morning, when London was awake, when the crowd could gather, when the news could spread. Tower Green could not hold them all, but that did not matter. The bells of the city rang when her head fell. All across London people stopped, listening to the sound that told them their queen was gone. It was death turned into an announcement, a broadcast of fear carried by iron bells. Anne's suffering was made into theater, her last breath twisted into performance. The silence of the night before, the prayers in the early hours, the endless waiting. All of it was part of the torment. Even the rescheduling of her death became a weapon. One moment she thought the end had come, then it was delayed, then delayed again. It was the slow drip of dread, the crushing weight of not knowing when the blade would fall. And there were the others, her co-accused, executed before her. 5 men, including her own brother George, cut down on false charges. Their deaths paved the way for hers, sealing her guilt before she ever spoke. The crowd saw them fall, heard their speeches, watched their bodies taken away. By the time Anne was brought forward, her fate was already painted in blood. 6 lives were taken to build a lie. 6 deaths bound together by falsehood, each one meant to reinforce the other. It was not only Anne who died. It was a purge, a cleansing by fear, a slaughter carried out to secure the king's will. Her death was cruel, but the cruelty was greater still in the days before. In the waiting, the silence, the lies, and the crushing certainty that truth itself had been murdered long before the sword struck her neck. Centuries have passed since Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold, yet her death still clings to history like a wound that refuses to close. What people often remember is the clean stroke of the French sword, the image of a queen who died with calm grace. But that memory is false, shaped by power, smoothed over by time. The truth is darker. The truth is that Anne was not only killed, she was unmade. Her story was twisted from the moment the charges were spoken. Lies of adultery, incest, and treason were pressed into the mouths of witnesses, hammered into the ears of the people, until belief itself bent to the king's will. The trial was theater, the verdict already chosen. Her last words were censored, her body discarded, her name buried under layers of shame. This was more than execution. It was character assassination. It was gaslighting written into law. Henry and his court destroyed her in every way, in body, in memory, in history itself. To them, death alone was never enough. The lies were wild, the evidence hollow, but the machinery of power made them real. The public was told she had betrayed her husband with many men, even her own brother. They were told she plotted to kill the king. In truth, no such crimes existed. Yet the crowd jeered, the bells rang, and the story hardened into fact. Power did not simply kill Anne. It rewrote reality itself. That is why her execution still haunts. The sword was quick, but the greater horror was slower. The destruction of truth, the erasure of memory, the shaping of a woman into a monster so that her death might seem just. This is the real lesson her story leaves behind, that power can twist even truth into ash. And Henry wasted no time. The day after her death, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks, he married her. Anne's body had not yet settled in the earth when she was replaced. Her life swept aside as if it had never mattered. The speed of it revealed the truth. Anne was never mourned. She was disposed of like a tool that no longer served. But history did not fully obey Henry's will. Though he tried to erase her, pieces of Anne's story endured. Her daughter Elizabeth, once cast aside as illegitimate, rose years later to become England's greatest queen. From the shadow of disgrace, she reclaimed her place, and in her reign, the memory of Anne flickered back into light. Still, the warning remains. Anne's execution was not simply the killing of a woman. It was the destruction of truth itself, the reshaping of memory by force. It was a demonstration of how far power will go to silence those it fears. When we think of Anne, we must remember not just the moment the blade fell, but the long campaign of lies, the humiliation, the silence forced upon her lips. We must remember the blood on the scaffold, the jeers of the crowd, the child stripped of her birthright, the grave left unmarked. Anne's death is not a tale of a queen who fell with dignity. It is a tale of how power erases, how truth bends, how memory can be murdered as surely as flesh. That is the darkness she leaves behind, a warning carved into history that truth itself can bleed.